Hey folks, it's Professor Diffley. This is History 110, Unit 4, video part 2. So last time we left off with Georgia. Now let's discuss slavery in the North, moving on to a different system. We've already talked about the Chesapeake, and now we're moving on to the North. Here we're talking about the Middle and New England colonies, so from pretty much Jersey up. Scope of slaveholding up in the North was much, much lower, average about 3 to 10% of the population of any colony. Even then, few, even including the wealthy, owned more than 1 or 2 slaves. Reason for this, no plantations up here. Slaves were not used in that way. It was not conducive to it, so there was not that many. Now, the Northerners were very much complicit and involved in slavery. Not only did they buy slave goods, they're going to use them in their products, think the textile mills. Moreover, a lot of the slave ships were bringing slaves to the Americas. Were actually based out of New England, think Rhode Island, ports like that, Connecticut, even Massachusetts. Insurance companies, many of the major large insurance companies were started this way, started by insuring slave stocks, slave ships and things like that. It permeated everything. That's a real big point of slavery. You did find, Hudson Valley region of New York did have a fair amount of slaves compared to other areas. You did have larger farms there, but and more farming communities, larger scale farms than what you find here in many ways, but not as many as the South. The cities where you found most slaves during this era, that was because they were often servants in households, served as in shops as skilled laborers or clerks, things like that. But that was you definitely had it. You'd see it more in some of the big cities. Slave laws in the North were definitely different. Slaves had more legal rights than in the North and even in the South. For example, marriages were recognized. They could bring cases in court. Even severe punishments were not allowed. They were still owned as property, but it was better than the South in terms of rights and freedoms that they had. Sorry about that. Accidentally closed it. Here's some more, just some images of the slave populations there. You can see how many more there were in the South, that sort of thing. Slave cultures in British North America, we've talked about that. 3 different slave systems and 3 different cultures, and how they became African American again in the areas of the Chesapeake in the North. They became a more melding of the 2 cultures, African and American, creating something completely new. And that's something we'll look at, especially later in the course. African religion, it becomes mixed in with Christianity in some places. In some places, Christianity is adopted totally. In many ways, too, probably arguably the first Muslims in America came during this time from Africa as slaves. And again, you're going to have these new cultures. Again, there's a lot in the notes on this. You did have free African American communities. One of the oldest that we know of in Massachusetts, in Great Barrington region. The great thinker W.E.B. Du Bois will be descended from this. Had been free from at least the time of the Revolution, if not earlier. Family was probably enslaved in the Hudson Valley, but had come over here. But again, there's more in the notes on this. And this is something we will definitely talk about more later in the class when we look at slavery as a whole right before the Civil War. Some more. Slaves did resist slavery, though. That is a question. They did resist all the time. People did run away. Not as common, though. It was usually younger, unattached men. Many of them would run away and come back at times, because, again, it's really hard to where you're going to get to there. But there was everyday resistance. This was more of what we call everyday resistance. Or silent sabotage. This is where slow down work, fake being sick, pretend not to understand commands, what they're told to do, their jobs, things like that. There was, easy ways to make a terrible situation easier, to make their lives somewhat easier as they could. But as you'll see in the notes there are crises. There are some larger uprisings. You have in New York City, there's a panic over, alleged information that leads to, unfortunately, killing of some African American slaves. You have the Stoner Rebellion. Again, you can see that in the notes down there. But these were, they had very little chance of really working. The biggest problem would be that, even if you burrows on one plantation, it'd be very hard to get the message out everywhere else. And because people were so afraid of this, they were, often prepared and would react harshly, to say the least, there. You can see more advertisements for this. British Empire. Let's get into this now. British views. So remember, while they're enslaving all these people, including the colonists, there was this view that they were the most free people on earth and the most advanced nation. Again, the contradictions are obvious that they own people. They're enslaving millions upon millions of people. But the way they saw this, they had cultural unity, common language, common law, mostly Protestant common language. They're often at war with Spain and France for many reasons, usually economic power reasons, but you could cast yourself against them as Catholics, so it created this sense of unity. British power was undisputed as the world's greatest commercial naval power. That's true for a long time coming. They had a parliamentary government, representatives. They had social mobility. You had a large middle class and more. We had London as a capital of an empire, a large city, cultural and financial and political cultural center, and capital, and which it still is in many ways. But yeah, London viewed itself, it understood how much power it actually had there. The political system is a constitutional monarchy heavily based on a parliament. There's no elected president. The prime minister of England comes from the party that has the most votes that can form a government, and then within the party they choose. If you just you could see this in British politics there. You have the legislature, parliament consisting of two houses, an upper and lower house, the House of Lords, where you had to be a noble, and the House of Commons in this. But that's their parliament. They get to make rules that way. British Constitution, interestingly, no single document like we have here later. There's a lot of it is a collection of documents or precedents, things that people say they will stand by, rules unwritten rules that they all believe in. Have you seen over the past few years in Brexit crisis in England, and even now, right now, that's an issue where not all the rules are written down. Heck, even in the U.S. with the rules written down in the Constitution, that can often be an interpretation, but they're not collected here. But they go back as far as the Magna Carta. We'll look at that more. This is, in the 13th century, the first statement of what the king can and cannot do, what the rights of the barons, a certain upper class are, eventually extend to others. They had a Bill of Rights that resulted from the Civil War and Glorious Revolution. They had these inalienable, or what they called guaranteed freedoms, the rule of laws where everybody follows the rule, that sort of thing. In terms of government and that. Balanced government, again, they had this idea that there were checks and balances. Here, the king's power of tyranny is checked by the House of Commons, and that, as we've seen in the Civil War, they executed the king, that sort of thing. Large portions, even though most people could not participate, they saw themselves as being the most open, and indeed they were. But only really here the English are going to allow landowners, certain classes, to vote. There was this belief that the political nation protected and looked out for everyone in the empire that was disenfranchised. So if you couldn't vote, don't worry, the people had England's best views at heart, not their own. They weren't looking just for their own thing. At least that is the belief here. Again, so what you had here are two real systems, republicanism and liberalism, classical liberalism. Republicanism is the idea that to be a patriot to be a Republican, you participate in public life with virtue, right, of doing things right. Virtue here means you can think beyond yourself, and that's why they limited participation to landowners and others of wealth. Why? The belief was they already have their own. They're trying to protect that and look out for everybody else. The fear has always been that if you let the poor vote, they will vote for things that only benefit them to try to get money. Usually they take it away from the rich. But that was republicanism. Part of it is you got to be a virtuous citizen, and that means taking part in politics, and the Country Party recognized that. And again, you can see the notes on this. Classical liberalism, this is more what we might call conservatism today. But essentially what it is free markets and how do I put this? Free markets and limited government is what we're looking at here. Focus on private rights. It's very individualistic. This is most well known as John Locke, who had a social contract idea. The idea that is people make up the government. They come together, give up some of their rights, pick a government, say what they can and cannot do. The Lockean triad here is, and we'll see this on the next one. Lockean triad is all about what is the government's purpose: protect life, liberty, and property is the idea. Individual rights, consent to the government's right to rebel are all Lockean ideas, and this idea of limited government there. Here's the social contract stuff. Again, it's from John Locke, supporter of all this. He rejected absolutism and divine right. Argued for a limited government only to protect life, liberty, and property. He becomes a significant influence on the Declaration of Independence. But yeah, he wants limited government. Fears government, too big of government gets out of hand and takes away all of our freedoms. In the colonial America, right to vote and its limit, dependents could not. So if you were not financially stable on your own, you had property qualifications, you had religious qualifications, usually having to be a Christian in most places. Would that be, again, you can see some of the notes on this. Political culture, lack of competitive elections. Usually people stood for election, and people deferred to their betters and the social superiors. So very few people would challenge a rich person or a leader who was running for office. So very, very lacking competitive. But there was this belief that some people are just better than others, and we should defer to them. Appointed officials, were appointed by the crown or colonial proprietors in many ways, and they're the ones that really had true power. So again, you see the limits on their power is minimal, and there's little oversight. So appointed officials often had power, although legislatures are there. You see these are the virtuous citizens taking part. You can notice just by their dress how wealthy they are there. Same here. And so the British government and net salutary neglect in the colonies, this will become more and more important as we go further in the class. Limited British focus on the Americas. They were distracted by events in Europe and rivalries in other areas. So they practiced salutary neglect, which more or less let the colonies govern them for themselves. As long as they were mostly following the rules for the empire, they could be left alone. England just didn't have the see the need to. So the colonial politics, the assemblies are eventually going to believe that they are independent of England. And that's where you get the rise of the assemblies. But because England was more or less, as long as they were making their money and that sort of thing, very simply, they were going to let them go. But you do get a political nation. Political nation is those that politics in public, right? People participating, talking about it, reading about it, that sort of thing. The public sphere is those who read and those who take part in all this. The public sphere is where we're outside of our lives, that private civil society groups and clubs, these learned societies and clubs where people would gather, talk, read, educate themselves. The philosophical society, you're probably in a civil society, think PTA, the car AAA, any political party, anything you're involved of like that, where you have a choice to join, and it's for your interest. And more you got higher literacy rates, traveling libraries, public newspapers. So this expanded literacy and expanded the public sphere and the political nation of who could participate and be and understand things there. Freedom of expression's limits, there was some, but not really. It had severe limits. The government did have checks on things, and you can see in the notes, and the trial of Peter Zenger shows this, the limits of all of this. You didn't have true freedom of speech. Government could check things that you were writing. A lot of this is focused from the Enlightenment, this revolution in human thought. This is all you really need to know for this. It is much deeper than this, but this is all we know. Application of scientific method, of learning, of thinking. Dare to know is what they said in the Enlightenment. Have the power to use your own mind and think for yourself. Most of them were deist. Deism was the belief that there is a creator, but not in the way we often think of it today. So when they refer to the creator, they believe that look at God as a master watchmaker. He had created this watch, and if you look inside a watch, it's really, really complicated. Everything fits together. Had created it, wound it up, put it down, and let it go, right? So he created it, put the system together, and let it go. It's a hands-off God. That was the belief there. Well, many of the deists believe that you have to, if you want change, you got to have it yourself. You got to find yourself, not relying on some higher power to do it for you. It is a general view of it, but that's a deist. Again, there's more in the notes. Just like goods, the Enlightenment came to America. What really was helping this was the spread of newspapers and the encyclopedias and libraries, and so people here in the Americas, because of cheap printing, could take part in this. I will continue in the next video for this part 3, Unit 4. All right, thank you.